Welcome to Centaur Financial Services podcast. The information provided on and made available through this video and podcast does not constitute as financial product advice. The information is of a general nature only and does not take into account your individual objectives, financial situation or needs. It should not be used, relied upon, or treated as a substitute for specific professional advice. We recommend that you obtain your own independent professional advice before making any decision in relation to your particular requirements or circumstances.
Hello and welcome back to our retirement series. My name's Anthony Mirandilla and I have here alongside me Nick Georgopoulos. Today we're going through a really good piece of content actually. It's probably stemmed from some feedback that we got from recent podcasts around. We understand it's so important to look at what we need to do when we're retiring, but also what do we need to do when we're actually in retirement? Those medium to later years of retirement. What are the things in your financial strategy that you should really look at or consider in your planning? So today, Nick and I will take you through a few things on that. First and foremost, this is general advice. So importantly, just make sure you talk to your advisor around this stuff. There's some good points, so have a chat with them when you can. So probably the first point I'd probably take us to here, mate, is along one of the bigger questions we get from most retirees is that longevity risk. And what that really means is for people in retirement, are we going to outlive what we've got in retirement? And I guess why that's important is for most, they just want to feel comfortable about money and not have to worry about it. So some of the things that we look at when we're thinking about spending patterns, we look at, generally speaking, is there's somewhat of a U-shaped spending pattern in retirement where, those earlier years, you're going to have a larger expense, you're going on more holidays, more overseas travel, seeing family, etc. And then things start to plateau and we move to that flat line. But then unfortunately or fortunately, it can go back up later in the piece due to differing reasons such as medical expenses or again, other things that come in your life with family, etc. But there is some other sort of thoughts on that as well, where now we are seeing a lot of people who are actually, their expenses just decrease. So there's other implications that can come along with that when we think about assets and their position and what they've got to do with their spending and of course, and what they should do with that. So probably one of the things we look at when we're talking about this is as part of a review or when you're speaking to an advisor, we just go through what your spending patterns need to look like based on what your retirement capital sits like. But importantly for then, you can really have a good understanding, of course, on what that will look like for you moving forward. Nick, any thoughts, mate?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, people are living longer. I think that's an important thing to consider. Going back 20, 30, 40 years, longevity wasn't at a place where it is now. When I say longevity, in this instance, it is how long you're going to live for. So bringing that back to the planning perspective, we take into account those items such as, the basic expenses, some of those lump sum expenses that come up in those three stages of retirement, as you explained within that U-shaped spending pattern. We do see people do spend less. But as we're having those conversations with our clients and understand, is there an estate planning factor to that we need to have something left over at the end? If that's not the case, can we spend a bit more on that front end of retirement? Do we need to ensure that we're spending the same amount throughout retirement when we know the facts aren't the case?
Yep.
Other aspects that come into that, I suppose, is having that right investment philosophy that backs up that spending pattern and that later stage of retirement. And it's quite simple when you think about it, right? As you're accumulating, as you enter retirement, that first period of retirement, the expectation is that your assets should look a lot different than what it would be towards that middle to end term of your retirement. Realistically, at the start there, we're still wanting to ensure that assets are being built, that capital is growing. Whereas that should change over time to, whilst ensuring income is still coming in and feeding the expenses that you do have, but more of that capital preservation piece as well. And I think bringing that back to the investment piece is, that just means a bit of a change up in the assets that you're actually holding. What works and what you should have at 60 isn't necessarily the same as if you're 80. And that might be that total profile. And we refer to them as your risk profile, whereas an accumulator, you might hold 80 to 90% of your assets in what we describe as growth assets, shares, property, etc. Whereas towards that end of your retirement, you might be something a lot lower than that, maybe having 60, 50, 40% of your assets in those growth assets.
Mm-hmm.
Again, what that priority is for you and then how you allocate those assets is person by person. There is no rule of thumb. And I think it's important where we see our role as advisors is important is having those conversations year on year as we do see our clients' expectations and their needs change. Mm-hmm. And therefore the portfolio should follow past there.
Yeah, mate, I feel like just on that, a couple of things that we sort of, when we're speaking with people, is it's like a flick of the switch, really, when they get closer to that, as they 80 and even later, 90 years old, that just the risk tolerance reduces significantly. And as Nick sort of pointed to there, that higher exposure to defensive assets just makes sense because you feel comfortable with it. And the other token there as well is when family get involved too, we've got to take that all into account in terms of what the family wants for you as well, because in essence, when we think about estate planning, it all sort of flows through. So again, it's probably just going to your point again, making sure you're having these conversations with regards to your objectives, your preferences, especially as you move through retirement, can really make sure your strategy is where it needs to be. Probably the other thing to note on this, mate, is in relation to Centrelink. You know, we talk a lot about your assets and what we've got. You know, the biggest thing in retirement for a lot of people is what you get from Social Security. And obviously when we're preparing you for retirement, we sort of put you in strategies where we're going to make sure we get the most for you.
Absolutely.
But importantly, legislation changes. And the thing with that is more means testing. You know, we get indexation of means testing on your assets test and income test. Also other things that can come our way, like we've seen more in recent times around certain retirement income streams or products and how they're assessed for means testing purposes. And these can evolve. And the beauty of that is we can assist you in the better way of structuring your assets to not only make sure your objectives are on track, but also making the most of those Social Security benefits for your overall strategy.
It's quite funny, isn't it? As you expect, as your expenses are reducing, you're not spending the money that's coming in, and therefore your assets are building up and growing over time. The effect that has on Centrelink is that those payments start to come down as your assets are growing. Which, given if that is the main goal, there are other items, like you say, different investment vehicles that you can consider putting money into the primary residence and updating it to reduce those assets into either exempt or Centrelink friendly assessment assets. But the other consideration there is utilising that build up of capital that you are getting to almost replace the reduction in age pension entitlements that you're getting there. So whether that be by nature of high interest savings, fixed income accounts, but also share investments that are generating a good level of income, which can replace that lower age pension figure now. Probably moving further on, sort of to that legacy, or even not quite to the legacy, because that's where we start to get into the estate planning, those conversations that come in there. But probably before that, some of those considerations in that last 10 years is where we don't really know which way expenses are going to go because there is that big unknown around what health looks like. Some people live a very long, prosperous life without any great deal of health issues, but something I'm seeing coming through our door more and more is dementia, aged care needs, more assistance required at home. And that's something that I think starting that planning process, starting that conversation a little bit earlier, understanding the history, whether that be health or family history, and understanding if that is something that we do need to start planning for. More and more, it's something that is almost left to, okay, well, we'll sell down the house if we need to fund residential aged care. The issue with that is predominantly there's two members of a couple, and 9 times out of 10, it's only one member of that couple that needs to go into aged care. The other is still living at home now independently. So there is no real asset available there, and that we're finding more and more that without that planning at the start of that, we do run into a bit of trouble because whilst the complex area aged care is, it's very, very expensive as well. Quite relevant now, coming up to 1st of July, there's new Aged Care Act as well. So a lot of these rules will be changed, especially how we're treating the refundable accommodation deposits. That will reduce in terms of the aged care facility keeping a small portion known as a hotelling fee. They are introducing more home care packages. So how I see as this new legislation comes through is that they're really wanting people to stay home for longer and take advantage of all of these new packages that are becoming available. The key to that part, it does cost. Okay, so a bit of planning, forward thinking around, okay, there may be actually now a higher increase in costs as we get to that back end.
Yep.
And then on the front side of retirement, eyes up, planning for that ahead.
I know Nick does a lot of work in this area, and I can really appreciate how complex it is based on the varying different situations that can come across his desk. So I can only imagine how tough it is for those who try and act upon this themselves. I would absolutely implore you to come and have a chat, especially in this area, because as Nick mentioned, the complexity just gets greater and greater each year that they choose to change legislation, which is just crazy. But
absolutely. What about estate planning? So what should people be considering in terms of estate planning, gifting funds away, making sure we're not paying too much tax in retirement, or even our dependents paying too much tax after we're gone? What are your thoughts around that?
I think it's not as simple as just having a will and your enduring power of attorney in place. That's unfortunately that's just ticking the box. There is a lot more that you really need to consider in terms of your own financial strategy in relation to your estate planning needs. And as Nick mentioned there are a few strategies that you really can put in play to ensure you do get the best outcome for your estate. And of course, your wishes are met versus, unfortunately, again, the ATO getting a good chunk of what you've really worked pretty hard to get and accumulate. So some of those things that we've got access to is gifting. So we've got gifting that we can utilise each year in certain amounts, and depending on your situation with regard to Social Security, there are limits. But importantly, if there's not that in place, then you can start to utilise things in a bit more detail for yourself.
I'll probably add in there, talk to your advisor before gifting your money away. Time and time again, we see that twofold. The gift really reduces the person's age pension. Now they have less money to live off, which wasn't a consideration in the first piece. If that's not, they may have also given away funds that were actually needed 10 years in the future.
Yep.
So understanding, okay, yes, it might provide benefit to the beneficiaries or future beneficiaries now, but are you going to leave yourself short by doing that?
Yeah, absolutely, mate.
Big planning potential.
Yeah, you're wrong. And just on the will and attorneys themselves, you've got to pick them up every 3 years, really. You've got to make sure that the executors are the people that you want to be there, and of course your beneficiaries, and importantly also your powers of attorney. One, they may not even be here is probably the thing that I've seen. I've had people with their executors the executors have passed, and they've not updated their wills, and it just creates further issues. So making sure you're just on top of the simple compliance piece. But one other thing to note in terms of structuring your assets is there is, unfortunately, and we've probably mentioned this a couple of times before, is around death tax and your superannuation benefits, and making sure that you address that earlier in the piece, so you ensure that later in the piece, which we're talking about now, you really have those things buttoned up, so to speak, and not in a position where you would cost a bit of your money again for the purpose of the ATO coming your way. Mate, probably the last thing I want to know, we've spoken a bit on that, is what is the role of a financial advisor when we talk about, in retirement planning later in life?
It's a good question, because there is a misconception that you start retirement, tick the box, everything's fine after that. But that's not the case. We go through life year on year at the moment. Things are changing for most people in my circle.
Yep.
It continues like that throughout retirement. Your preferences change, like we've already gone through. Your income and expenses and lump sum needs change. So where does the advisor come into place there? They're facilitating the conversation, bringing these items to your attention, but also making the changes to ensure that you stay on track and can pivot away from the original plan as these things pop up. Yeah, any thoughts there from your side?
Yeah, I think one of the bigger things that I see more of now, and especially with regard to estate planning, is we really do get the families involved.
Yeah.
So again, to make sure that there's that smooth transition on the estate side, but importantly, just so they're aware. One of the big things, and I only just had a meeting very recently, how with a client, he's very concerned about what things would look like for him moving forward, especially with regard to health and the potential diagnosis of dementia and things. And then it's his worry of how's everything going to be dealt with. And he just wanted that confidence to know that his plan is going to be okay. Obviously, comfortable having his advisor, but the fact that he could then bring in his powers of attorney or family to be aware of those things, and we can somewhat project manage and facilitate that moving forward so that we really get that in place for our clients.
And they're complex issues, right? For many, it's a difficult conversation to facilitate themselves with the family. I feel there is value of having a third party within that, explaining
100%.
these things, making sure everybody's on the same page. So it's really at the heart of all that mum and dad's wishes are what we're talking about here. And it's not a future inheritance and how to maximise that for that person. It's getting that very clear from the very start. So there's no confusion when mum or dad is gone in the future. There's no fighting in the estate. And we really reduce a lot of that estate and family risk at that point. Mate, that pretty much sums it up for the items I'm thinking about. If we run through a quick summary of what we've spoken about today, there's obviously looking at and thinking about the longevity side of things when it comes to the retirement planning. We understand that there is a likelihood of expenses and the need of those expenses changing throughout your retirement. I touched on the investment piece as well, how having the right assets or the right portfolio for purpose is crucial throughout your retirement. Centrelink, there's a few items that could change, so having a partner by your side to making sure that we're making the right decisions throughout retirement. Aged care, very complex. Talk to your advisor around it, and that is an area that is always changing. What have I missed there?
Mate, I think you nailed it on the head. We are absolutely looking forward to seeing you at our next podcast, where we will talk about the family home and aged care. Importantly, as we've sort of noted today, a very complex area where we'll highlight a few of those issues that you should be aware of and probably more conversation points with your advisor and family. But on that note, we look forward to having you there, and again, continue with your feedback. This one stemmed from some great feedback, so look forward to that.
Thank you for joining us.